I tell you, one of the this is it is a pleasure to be here with everyone today. Getting used to this virtual Zoom world, but I'm still not as sharp as I would like to be. Especially in times like this, one of the most difficult things about these Zoom things is in doing these kind of gatherings is those who have been present and at places where I've spoken before know that I like to move a lot. I like to walk a lot. I like to move around, and trying to stay seated in front of a camera to give a talk sometimes is difficult for me. But I'll do my best to try to stay within the range of the camera here for us today. I am grateful for the commitment of Decorah UU and their focus this month on the theme of beloved community. I will be touching on that theme in general and on the topic of the cost of community in particular. The word community literally means common unity. Communities are built upon commonalities that unite the members of a community. For Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., part of the commonality uniting his beloved community is our humanity. For King, members of the beloved community are united by their recognition of and commitment to their shared humanity. King believes that recognition of and commitment to shared humanity is demonstrated through justice. For King, the establishment of the beloved community requires the establishment of justice for all people. As Dr. King often said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. As we heard just a little while ago in the reading from Rosemary Bray McNatt, nothing that we need to do is more important than making justice real here where we are. In that piece, she said, if we do not bring justice to the world, none of us is safe, and none of us will survive. For King, the beloved community is about making justice real here where we are, not some future place where we might go. This idea of making justice real here where we are is reflected in Christianity in what is commonly referred to as the Lord's Prayer. According to Christian tradition, when Jesus' followers asked him to teach them how to pray, he instructed them to pray in this way: Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The prayer is about establishing the reign of God's justice on earth, here where we are. While there's often debate about what constitutes justice, I believe at the heart of justice is a recognition of the equal humanity we all share. The sort of racialized police violence on display in the brutal murder of George Floyd is one of the many blatant examples of a systemic disregard for the humanity of Black people. Acts of police violence against Black people are not simply random acts. Police violence represents systemic violence. That is to say, violence that is authorized and protected by a legal system that repeatedly allows for and exonerates police officers who engage in the killing of unarmed Black people, who engage in a blatant disregard for the humanity of Black people. This sort of systemic disregard for the humanity of Black people has long been a barrier to the establishment of King's beloved community. Systemic disregard for the humanity of Black people is enshrined in the founding documents of our nation. The premise of chattel slavery was that enslaved Black people and the children born to them were property, not human beings. The 3/5 clause is one of the rare places in the Constitution where it was even suggested that enslaved Black people might be human. The 3/5 clause, written in 1787, provided that representation in Congress would be based on the whole number of free persons and 3/5 of all other persons. The other persons referred to enslaved Black people. Now, while most Americans at that time denied the humanity, or at least the equal humanity, of enslaved Black people, the so-called personhood of enslaved people was partially acknowledged so that slave states would get extra representation in Congress for enslaved Black people, even though those states treated enslaved Black people purely as property rather than as human beings. 70 years later, in 1857, a case came before the US Supreme Court reaffirming this perspective. The case before the court was that of Dred Scott v. Sanford. In that case, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney declared that all Black people, enslaved as well as free, were not and could never become citizens of the United States. Taney wrote in the court's majority opinion that because Scott was Black, he was not a citizen and therefore had no right to sue. The framers of the Constitution, he wrote, believed that Black people had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. Referring to the language of the Declaration of Independence that includes the phrase, all men are created equal, Taney went on to say, quote, it is too clear for dispute that the enslaved African race were not intended to be included and formed no part of the people who framed and adopted this declaration. Now, this legal denial of the humanity of Black people, upon which this nation is founded, is to this day on blatant display, not only in the repeated acts of police violence, but in the repeated exoneration of police officers who murder unarmed Black people with impunity. The recent murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor are simply two among many of a long list of unarmed Black people brutally killed by police officers. And lest one think this spate of police killings of Black people is a recent development, it is important to remember that Dr. King sought a day when police abuse and racial violence would be a thing of the past. In an often forgotten or intentionally ignored part of his 1963 speech during the March on Washington, King raised the issue of police violence. King stated, quote, there are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? King then responded, we can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. His words continue to resonate nearly 60 years later. Today, Americans are still demanding an end to the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. I believe one of the reasons we have not seen an end to racialized police brutality and other manifestations of racial inequity is because we have not prioritized ending the horrors of police brutality or ending the horrors of systemic racial inequities. While we get upset and protest when blatant acts of racialized police violence and other acts of systemic racialized violence occur, we do not make ending such acts of violence a priority. While state political primaries were held in Iowa this past week, I never heard a single candidate make ending racial disparities a priority. Furthermore, the only time I heard any of the dozens of presidential candidates who came through Decorah and northeastern Iowa addressed issues of racial inequities is when they were responding to questions I asked them about racial inequities. Many of the same people who are outraged by the recent murder of George Floyd and who protest other acts of police violence will say to me when I make the issue of racial inequities a political priority that while they understand my concern, universal health care is a national concern. The economy is a national concern. Climate change is a global concern. They repeatedly express how racial inequities are lower on their list of priorities because in their mind, racial inequities only impact a small percentage of Americans, while concerns such as healthcare, the economy, and climate change impact a much larger swath of people. This way of thinking reveals a complete and total failure to understand the interrelatedness of all humanity, as well as the concept of beloved community. As long as racial inequities are relegated to reactionary issues rather than a universal priority, acts of racialized police violence will continue to occur, and people will continue to act shocked when such violence happens. Until we make the establishment of beloved community a priority, racial injustice and other forms of injustice will continue to recur. This prioritization requires a reordering of our priorities. In his speech, Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence, King criticized American leadership and called for a radical revolution of values. King's revolution called for a reordering of priorities. According to King, there is nothing except a tragic death wish that prevents us from reordering our priorities. King's reordering of priorities reflects an awareness of our shared humanity and the interrelatedness of all life. King asserted that since humanity is interrelated, one cannot harm another without harming oneself. King stated, "To the degree that I harm my brother, no matter what he is doing to me, to that extent I am harming myself." Why is this? Because all men are brothers. If you harm me, you harm yourself. Love is the only cement that can hold this broken community together. When I am commanded to love, I am commanded to restore community, to resist injustice, and to meet the needs of my brothers. For King, this revolution of values is something that is required of all of us, not simply our leaders or the police. While it is easy to get angry at the police and our elected political leaders, they are an expression of what we, as members of society, have allowed and empowered them to do. Most Americans ask and expect the police to maintain the status quo, because many Americans have identified protection as the preservation of privilege. Many Americans consider the job of the police to protect their privilege from threat. And many Americans identify Black people as the greatest threat to their privilege. The police, therefore, often do what many Americans want them to do: protect their privilege, protect the status quo. Americans have empowered police and politicians to do what many members of society want, but are unwilling and or unable to do themselves. Many Americans seek the preservation of their privilege while blaming police and democratically elected leaders for the tactics used to preserve those privileges. They want to preserve their privileges without getting their hands dirty. They empower politicians and police, therefore, to do the dirty work needed to maintain their privileges. King's demand for a revolution of values, however, lays the responsibility and accountability at the feet of all Americans. When atrocities like the police murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor happen, it's not enough to lament and express outrage. Americans, especially white Americans, have to be willing to take responsibility and recognize their own complicity. As stated previously, many Americans expect and have empowered police to control Black people. This is illustrated most clearly in the case of Amy Cooper, a white woman who recently called the police on Christian Cooper, a Black man engaged in bird watching in Central Park. I have a brief video of that interaction, if it can be loaded up at this time.
Can you all see my screen?
Got it.
Got it? All right, let's try this.
Would you please stop? Sir, I'm asking you to stop.
Please don't come close to me.
Sir, I'm asking you to stop recording me.
Please don't come close to me.
Please take your phone off.
Please don't come close to
And I'm
me.
taking a picture and calling the cops.
Please call the cops. Please call the cops.
I'm going to tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life.
Please tell them whatever you like.
Excuse me? I'm sorry, I'm in the Ramble, and there is a man, African-American, he has a bicycle helmet. He is recording me and threatening me and my dog. There is an African-American man in Central Park. He is recording me and threatening myself and my dog. And my... I'm sorry, I can't hear you either. I'm being threatened by a man in the Ramble. Please send the cops immediately. I'm in Central Park in the Ramble. I don't know.
Thank you.
Thank you for showing that. For those unfamiliar with the incident, on the same day, Minneapolis police officers later murdered George Floyd, Amy Cooper called police on Christian Cooper, no relation, after he asked her to put a leash on her dog. The encounter occurred in the Ramble Woodland area of Central Park in New York. The Ramble is noted for its bird watching opportunities, where bird watchers can catch a glimpse of some of the approximately 230 species found in the woods. Christian Cooper was engaged in bird watching that day when the encounter took place. Because the Ramble is a protected wooded area, park rules state that dogs in the Ramble are required to be on leashes. Christian Cooper asked Amy Cooper to obey the rules and place her dog on a leash. When she refused, Christian Cooper began recording her. The video clip is part of that recording. Now, as can be witnessed in the video, Amy Cooper identified the race of Christian Cooper several times. She repeatedly stated that she was being threatened by an African-American male because she fully expected the police to do what many Americans have empowered them to do: preserve the status quo by keeping Black people, especially Black men, in their place. She even goes so far as to inform Christian Cooper of her plan to tell the police that an African-American man is threatening her life. Amy Cooper was fully aware that she was invoking white privilege, and she wanted Christian Cooper to know she was invoking white privilege. Amy Cooper did what white Americans have been doing for hundreds of years, pretending to be the victim of Black misbehavior, knowing that the system would see her as the innocent one. In a racialized America, the assumption of innocence is an aspect of white privilege. Amy Cooper knew this, and she invoked that privilege. The fact that she invoked this privilege so quickly and naturally reveals that she has internalized this privilege as an inherent right that she possesses. She didn't even have to think about what she was going to do. She just did it. Her actions are an example of what many call reflexive racism. Racist actions that people engage in that have become so natural and instinctive that the actions function as mere reflexes. Fortunately, Christian Cooper was not present when police arrived in the park. Had he been present, the police quite possibly would have done what Amy Cooper expected them to do, what American society has empowered them to do, what we witnessed them do that same day in Minneapolis with George Floyd. It's easy to get mad at the police when they engage in blatant acts of racial violence. But police are often doing what society has empowered them to do. They are doing what Americans like Amy Cooper and others expect them to do. Protect their privileges, protect their status quo. Americans have to take responsibility for creating and supporting this expectation. Creating a beloved community requires members of such a community to take responsibility for their actions, especially actions that disregard the humanity of every member of that community. Responsibility and accountability are the cost of community. I'm sure some of what I've said today might be hard to hear. Creating a beloved community, however, requires hearing hard truths. There can be no reconciliation and healing without truth. There can be no beloved community without truth. And the truth of the matter is, Americans, especially white Americans, need to take responsibility for systemic racial violence and inequities in America. Building beloved community that recognizes the commonality of our humanity requires being accountable and taking responsibility. This sentiment was expressed by Dr. King's friend, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Heschel asserted, morally speaking, there is no limit to the concern one must feel for the suffering of human beings. Indifference to evil is worse than evil itself. And in a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible. We are all responsible to work together for the creation of beloved community. While the current state of affairs might cause some to feel hopeless and discouraged and consider the notion of beloved community a utopian fantasy, I'd like to end with the words of Frederick Douglass in response to Taney's ruling in the Dred Scott decision. In a speech following that decision, Douglass said, "This infamous decision of the slave-holding wing of the Supreme Court maintains that slaves are within the contemplation of the Constitution of the United States property. The slaves are property in the same sense that horses, sheep, and swine are property. That colored persons of African descent have no right that white men are bound to respect. You may readily ask me how I am affected by this devilish decision. My answer is, and to no thanks to the slave-holding wing of the Supreme Court, my hopes were never brighter than now. I have no fear that the national conscience will be put to sleep by such an opening, glaring, and scandalous tissue of lies as that decision is and has been over and over shown to be. The Supreme Court of the United States is not the only power in this world. It is very great, but the Supreme Court of the Almighty is greater. Judge Taney may decide and decide again, but he cannot reverse the decision of the Most High. He cannot change the essential nature of things, making evil good and good evil. Happily, for the whole human family, their rights have been defined, declared, and decided in a court higher than the Supreme Court. Douglas's statement, of course, is a statement of faith, not a statement of fact. Just as pursuing the establishment of beloved community is an act of faith. We gather today as people of faith. It is my hope and my prayer that our faith continues to inspire us to work for the creation of beloved community, where the recognition of and commitment to our shared humanity serves as our common unity. God bless you.